Well, of course, for most of us, we have certain totemic moments in our lives, moments that stand out more than any other, significant events around which we seem to calibrate our calendars as being before that event or after. And for, I think, probably everybody of my generation, and indeed most people listening now, the most significant of those totemic events in their lives was September 11, 2001, when a series of 4 coordinated terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda struck the United States on the morning of Tuesday, September the 11th, 20 years ago tomorrow. To paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, 9/11 delivered us some known knowns and some known unknowns. Or put another way, the deadliest terrorist attack in human history provided some measurable effects in its immediate aftermath, but also plenty of long-term consequences, many of which we, to this day, continue to try to decipher. Well, the known knowns are the statistics and the facts. The attacks on this day 2 decades ago resulted in 2,977 fatalities and over 25,000 injuries. It remains the single deadliest incident for firefighters and law enforcement officers in US history. It was also a Helen of Troy event, the catalyst that launched not so much 1,000 ships, but Allied militaries into Afghanistan and then, of course, into Iraq, and was the genesis of the War on Terror, a state of war which, probably like that between the 2 Koreas, will most probably never officially end, an ever-present fog. Well, as for the less tangible, more debatable consequences of 9/11, well, they're many, from the prevalence of fear to the growth of government and the security apparatus in our lives, to the new obstacle course-like set-up at airports in the name of keeping us safe. These and more all probably had their birth that fateful morning in September of 2001. Well, to unpack this in some detail, Professor Greg Barton, no stranger to the program, chairing Global Islamic Politics at Deakin University, joins me on the line. Greg, good to talk to you.
Great to be back with you, thanks.
Pleasure. 20 years ago, it really doesn't seem that long, and probably in part, I guess, Greg, because many of the things that changed immediately after September 11, particularly around the security of the state, have continued to this day.
Yeah, and they didn't just change with September 11th. I mean, we were worried about attacks on aircraft and hijacking, etc., before 9/11. We didn't think of aircraft being used as weapons before 9/11, so that was a change. We were worried that people bring bombs on board aircraft. And we weren't even really thinking about suicide bombing, because we thought if we checked whether a passenger was on board the aircraft when their luggage was there, that would deter somebody from putting a bomb in the luggage hold. 9/11 gave us a different kind of enemy. It gave us an enemy that was prepared to use suicide attacks and work in innovative ways. But most of all, 9/11 was a great big provocation. It was an outrageous, horrible, terrible thing that was designed to make us angry and get us to respond, which we did, of course. And many of the things in that response have been productive in terms of stopping further attacks, but many other things have ended up being counterproductive in ways that we didn't understand or intend at the time.
As far as the response is concerned, I mean, the 2 obvious responses were the invasion in Afghanistan and also the war in Iraq. We can all be wise in hindsight, but were they appropriate responses?
Well, the operation in Afghanistan began with special forces going in, Americans, but also some Australians. And that was pretty successful. It was designed to get bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda leadership and to drive Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. It didn't completely achieve its objectives because partly it wasn't supported enough. There weren't enough special forces on the ground. They worked with local Afghans, and the local Afghans, for reasons that became familiar in the last 20 years, were persuaded to let bin Laden and many of his leaders get away, first of all to eastern Afghanistan, then ultimately on to Pakistan. The Pakistan interference considerably added to complications over the years. But through 2002, that became a very different operation because unexpectedly the Taliban regime in Kabul fell, and it was over by the end of 2001. And we found ourselves embroiled in a program to rebuild Afghanistan. But before we even got very far down that path, attention had shifted to Iraq. In fact, on the day of 9/11 itself, Donald Rumsfeld was saying, now we have to go to Iraq. It wasn't a good and logical reason. And I think history would be very different if we hadn't gone to Iraq. I think that was a distraction and actually created other insurgencies, the most powerful of them being what became Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, beginning with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. If we hadn't done that, I think the outcome would have been very different. But long story short, in 20 years, we got suckered into fighting terrorism by military means, and the military means gave us success in battle after battle, but we lost the war.
You speak of the war of terror and fighting using military means, but how can we defeat what is in essence an ideology? It's something that's held in people's brains. If a terrorist subscribes to terrorist ideology, it's not as if they're necessarily wearing the T-shirt saying, here I am. It's inside them, and they may choose to then enact that in a physical manifestation of suicide bombing, a knife attack, whatever. But I mean, when one goes to war, one usually has an end goal in mind, and that is victory. Is this, I mean, if we're being honest, is this actually a war that could ever be won?
Well, I think you've touched on it. When we go to war, any military operation, any military strategists will say you've got to be very clear about what your end game is, where you want to end up, what you're trying to achieve. We never had that clear with Afghanistan. We didn't have it clear with Iraq. It's a mistake we've repeatedly made all through what we framed as the war on terror. And I think the mistake began actually with framing it as a war. A special forces operation to go after bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda leadership, that made sense. I think it was inevitable that it should happen. And I think with the fall of the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2001, trying to change Afghanistan in a way that would make it less likely to succumb to the Taliban and to Al-Qaeda also made sense. We went about that the wrong way, and partly it was because we got so fixated in thinking that we were like the adage of the man with a hammer who sees everything as enough. We thought we had this really powerful modern military, and that surely would be able to fix the problem. We spent more time in the areas where we were successful, which was transforming Afghan society. The population almost doubled during that period. It's a very young population. They're now reasonably well educated, particularly women and girls is the obvious difference. That was a successful transformation. We put in a centralised government that didn't fit well with a very sort of federal rugged topography of Afghanistan, where a non-centralised approach would have been so much more effective. And we did the same thing, or the US led in doing the same thing with the military, a military that was dependent on civilian contractors, highly centralised, very expensive, very high-tech. Those two exercises failed, but there was another path there that could have worked. And even this year, there was another path that arguably could have worked, but we kept seeing things in rather simplistic terms. Then the invasion of Iraq is a whole different story, but it's hard to see any way of looking back and saying that made sense. I know that it's justified. Even today, Paul Wolfowitz, who I think is well-intentioned and idealistic, is still justifying going to Iraq. But I think that's, a failure to learn the lesson of history. Really, that was a mistake. And most people who were involved in that, who at the time even thought it was a good idea, now say it was a mistake.
From a psychological point of view, Greg, the legacy for America, I think, has been profound. I was reading a piece by Tim Lynch, Professor of Political Science at the University of Melbourne yesterday, who said in the 1990s, Americans grew used to winning. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the US economy was booming, but September 11, 2001, he said, changed all of that. The dot-com boom was replaced by a war on terror. And psychologically, I'm not sure America has ever been the same since. The sense of fear has certainly seemed to seep into most crevices of the state.
Yeah, in some ways it's facing up to reality. You could say we were mugged by our reality. We sort of partly owe it on ourselves, but life is complex. It's not the world is not a place in which you can have just one superpower always winning. Francis Fukuyama wrote famously about the end of history, but that, there's a lot of truth in what he wrote. It's a clever book, but it's also rather simplistic to think that it falls out so simplistically. We should have realised after the experience of Vietnam that if you get engaged in a war where you can't define what your end goal is, and you're fighting an insurgent force that comes from the local population and knows the local terrain, all they have to do is wait you out. It doesn't matter how many battles you win, as long as they're the last man standing, even if they've lost a lot of people in the process, they win. That's what we learned from Vietnam, and yet somehow we didn't have that in mind when we went to Afghanistan and then again, of course, in Iraq. So that, of course, did sap confidence. But there was a decade there after the fall of the Soviet Union when, perhaps we could have gone about things in a different way. It would have always been complex, but we squandered the opportunity. We probably should have engaged more with Russia immediately after the fall. We probably should have done a lot of things, including investing, by the way, in Afghanistan after the Soviet military left and preventing the rise of what became the Taliban. That would have saved everyone a lot of grief.
Before you go, I just referenced there Professor Tim Lynch. Now, he's a professor of political science, granted, but I just want your take on this. He said that the war on terrorism, on carbon dioxide, on loose credit, on COVID-19 for that matter, all morphed into existential struggles demanding political and cultural obedience, or, put another way, as he says, zero tolerance, zero emissions, COVID zero, as targets of public policy. These all had their origin at ground zero. Half measures to realise safety exposed on September 11, he says, were replaced by a form of absolutism and an obsession with root causes, and common to all because of 9/11 was the designation of the threat as systemic. Have we, I think what he's saying there is governments ever since 9/11 have gone further in their reach than perhaps they ever would have prior to 9/11. Do you see that more broadly as a consequence?
Yeah, look, it's compelling rhetoric, and I think there's a lot of truth in the analysis. One of the things we can take away is that in relying on this military approach to fighting terrorism, and I think anything that's framed as a war we need to be sceptical of. That's one lesson, whether it's a war on drugs or a war on terror or a war on COVID, we need to not succumb to the temptation to think we can get total victory and get suckered into that romantic vision. But with that military dependence, it didn't just stay offshore. It came back onshore in America. American police forces, they're much more complex than us because they've got state troopers and, local city police and state police and federal police, have become heavily militarized. They literally drive around in some areas with armored personnel carriers and use military-style weapons. And, once again, the man with the hammer, you militarize, armor up police like that, and they tend to overuse force in responding to problems, and that creates its own cycle of problems. One of the results of that, which is not immediately obvious until you start to think about it, is that by creating this fear of Al-Qaeda, and it's a very real threat, but by sort of overly focusing on this threat, we began to think in terms of a danger coming from immigrants, from Muslims, from people within us. And not only was that really traumatizing for the Muslim community in America, for example, but it also fed into the rise of far-right ideas. So, there was a problem with far-right ideas well before 9/11. Europe's had a long problem with neo-Nazis. But in the last 10 years, 3/4 of all terror attacks in America have come from the far-right. And that has something to do with the way in which society became militarized, became polarized, was vulnerable to the rise of populist politics. And unfortunately, rather than dealing with a long-lasting problem of race and intolerance, doubled down and made things worse. So none of that was foreseen or intended, but it's now something that has to be dealt with. And you're right, Tim Lynch is right. This is part of this foolish mistake of succumbing to the romantic allure of thinking that we can win this war without even defining what it is we're trying to do.
Instructive to talk to you as always, Greg. Thank you for your time this morning.
Great to join you. Thanks very much.
Professor Greg Barton there, chairing Global Islamic Politics at Deakin University.